Before we get started, I have to make mad apologies to the one and only Monique Couvson. She is here with us. I wanted her here, and I forgot to put her back on the website. My sincerest apologies, Monique. So please don't hold it against me. And unfortunately, Joan Morgan will not be able to join us today because she's not feeling well. But we're going to carry on, and I'm super excited for every single individual that you see before you. And just so you guys know, I will remove this white blare from your face. I just want to make sure everyone sees what where you can ask some questions. And we're using menti.com again, and especially those out there on the live stream, you might want to write this down or take a screenshot. And the code is 8403-7192, 8403-7192. And we are going to have Anil take it away because I want to hear every single second of this conversation. So
yes,
go ahead.
Thank you. So I got to start by just telling y'all, I'm geeked out. I'm excited because these are authorities. These are the experts. These are the folks that I love to learn from and read from. So to get to just even talk to y'all, Dr. King, Dr. Couvson, Dr. Neal, this is expertise. We're very lucky to have this conversation. I want to start. We got so much to do, so I'm going to go fast. And what I want to start with is let's call it the casual narrative about Prince's album, 1999. The place it has in his career, the place it has in culture, this is a, let's call it crossover album. This is an accessible album. And I think there's a very white lens on, and a respectability lens on who is this album for, what performance does it have, what job does it do in his career, and what impact it had. And I feel like that's where I want to start for you all to contextualize what is this album in Prince's career and what is this album in the world if we go back 40 years ago. Let me start right here.
Small question. I think part of the reason that 1999 gets the kind of crossover narrative attached to it is because it is the album that really allows Prince to break into the Hot 100, right? Top 40. It is his top 40 record, more so than the previous records, which just didn't have the singles that broke in that way. It's also, of course, the record that dovetails with MTV playing his music. So he generated a kind of mainstream visibility that he didn't have previously. It's also the album in which radio, specifically white rock radio, I want to be very specific about those two terms, they start playing his music, especially after MTV kind of forces their hand into doing so. And of course, MTV's hand had to be forced into playing any black music because it didn't see itself, that's the language they use, they didn't see themselves as a network that was intending to play black music, wasn't fitting their demographic. So people like Prince helped explode that. Changed the possibility for the formatting on MTV, the formatting on radio. So in those senses, I do think it is a crossover record in that sense, right? In the way that we were using the term racial crossover, the phrase racial crossover in the early 80s to describe the kind of genre leaps that were happening with the Pointer Sisters, with Michael Jackson, with Lionel Richie, with people like Prince. The challenge with that terminology is that for anyone who is well-versed in Prince lore, which is everyone in this room and probably on Zoom too, or on video as well, 1999 is a continuation of his previous records, right? It's artistically a continuation, creatively a continuation, and it's not a clean break. It's not as if he said, hey, you know what? I need a bigger white audience, so suddenly let me change everything that I'm doing. There are some subtle changes that he's actually making from a musical standpoint and an arrangement standpoint, particularly the use of the guitars on Little Red Corvette. This is a record about fast women, fast cars, in a way that, I think kind of got the ear, seduced the ear, as one might say, of some of the white rock listeners who had previously disavowed him. There's also that famous story, of course, in which Prince was opening for the Rolling Stones and was booed off stage by white rock audiences, and it was a mostly white audience at that crowd. And so that just reminds you of the fact that black artists who wanted to work outside of the box had extreme glass ceilings, extreme limitations, right? This was a culture of extreme anti-blackness. This is post-disco, in which black artists had very, very strict kind of limitations in what they could do or not do. So 1999 was like a grenade that sort of blew all of that up. It was one of the albums that did that. There were other albums and other songs and other artists who were doing that as well. But 1999 did that in a spectacular way. But I do think it's a limitation to call it just a crossover album and to look at it only as an example of Prince's shrewdness, right? That he was just doing this simply to get over. He was making the music that he wanted to make. He was making the music that he felt in his heart, in his spirit, in his body, that he could make, and he was expanding the available kind of stylistic and creative options for black artists in that time period. And so I think it's important to realize it as a album by a black artist simply trying to exercise their creative freedom.
Also, there's something inherently, implicitly anti-black in assuming that Prince was a nobody before that album, right? And that it's important not to characterize it as such because, when there is creation and innovation occurring in the black community, we're gonna get it first anyway. And so there is a way that it was moving in circles and his art was embraced by the community that generated and produced Prince, that was celebrated and engaged and hanging on to what was next in a way that when 1999 hit, that was like the fall semester of my 5th grade year, and I remember as a little young Monique, being like, "Oh, Prince has a new album," right? And it was like something that we expected to engage because we were listening to black radio. We were listening to, I'm from the Bay Area in California, and we were listening to KPOO. Like, we were listening to the stations that would play it, and so we would hang on it. So I think we have to challenge that narrative of this being simply a crossover space to build upon what you're saying, certainly to acknowledge the brilliance of it and acknowledge the extension of it from his previous work, but also to explicitly reject the notion that he was somehow less significant because he was being celebrated in black spaces.
For me, I always have to read Prince in this moment alongside the other dominant black male R&B singers in that moment. It is the end of the reign of Teddy Pendergrass for reasons out of his control. And really the people who were vying, with no disrespect to Bobby Brown, to be the king of R&B at the time, it's really Prince, Michael, Luther Vandross, and Rick James. Right. And if anything, Rick James had sort of built a blueprint for the crossover possibilities without selling out the music. Right. And of course we know they had, huge, beef between, competitiveness between them, as was the case with Michael. But I think the thing that's important to think about Prince's music in this moment, and the best black music, white audiences had always crossed over to the best black music. Right. If anything, there were cases of black artists who might have exhausted their success amongst black audiences, who had a breakthrough hit, who tried to follow up on that crossover and wasn't successful. I think about Jeffrey Osborne, right, and what happens after the Woo Woo song, right? Both in terms of his relationship to black audiences who kind of leave him alone, right? You can make the same claim about Lionel Richie, right, in that kind of moment. But what happens to Prince afterwards does not suggest that was the case, right? And as Monique just said, he continued to make the music that he was making before and continued to make the music afterwards, right, that black radio never gave up on, right? Black Album played that Parade album, right? And he was always shrewd in the way that he did his albums that I think many artists learned afterwards to be able to feed every beast possible. Right, when you drop these albums, right? Because you can't listen to International Lover and say that he was trying to cross over to white audiences.
Yeah, I think the thing is, it's not that he crossed over, it's that the formats and the outlets learned to be less racist, slightly, maybe, right? Maybe, by saying, okay, well now we can play this thing that we had previously excluded, right? And now let's say that you're crossing over. So I think that's where the problem is. But I grew up in Canada, in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. I was happening there.
Just for folks on the stream, the question is, what was happening there? That was the question.
So my parents are from Trinidad. They migrated to Canada in the late 1960s. They had me and my brother. And so early 80s, we listened to whatever you could get. Basically, whatever was on radio, whatever was on TV. Canada has content rules and allowances, so we didn't have MTV. We had Much Music, which was the kind of sister channel. And 1999 is the first time I heard Prince. It was the first time I saw Prince. Because it just wasn't available anywhere else. It was only when he came through Top 40 and only when he came through MTV or other video channels that he became a presence to me. And then I kind of went back and through the Edmonton Public Library found Dirty Mind, found Controversy, but it was not played on radio. And I think that's the case for a lot of people who didn't grow up in the US. They just had not heard of Prince until he came through those circuits.
I just love when we're talking about a man from Minnesota, and everybody's like, Canada? Canada, wow, all right. So one of Canada exists. It's real. So one of the points you made. This is an album about fast cars and fast women. I want to pull on a thread there. Before there's a lot we can say about sort of gender in this album, but I want to actually go into the cars point because we've got obviously Little Red Corvette. We've got Lady Cab Driver. They've got a cab in the song. We got International Lover. There's planes. Delirious, yeah, right. Take a little ride. Like there's a lot here that is about motion and moving and vehicles and transit and transportation. I'm curious, like this is this moment, 1982 is an interesting moment. You have the air traffic controller strike being busted. Like there's this interesting thing about movement and labor that's sort of all wrapped up in this. I mean, how much do you all think this is of the moment, or this is the thing where like it's his vision versus what's happening in the world? Not to put you all on the spot.
Yeah, I'll start. I think he was obviously an intelligent man who was following current affairs and engaged in some of the political conversations, at least from a distance at this time. I do think that there, so I'll hold if I think that you're gonna go into some of the representations around femininity and some of those ideas that represent on this album and as they express on this album. But I do believe that in the 80s everybody was talking about cars, right? It was a kind of attachment. It was something that could anchor him in the sort of current cultural space, but also invite people into a conversation that he was trying to have about a lot of other things. And so it was just accessible. It took me a long time, because obviously at that time I was pretty young. It took me a long time to realize that we weren't talking about an actual Corvette, right? Or that we were actually talking about it. I was like, how does a cab driver have a mansion, right? And so I think there were all of these questions that I had because I didn't quite understand the metaphors.
Shit, I just realized.
So I do think, that there is this brilliance that he brings to the lyrics and to the conversations about what it means to be young and free in this moment in 1982 or 81 or 82, right? When he's creating this music and putting it together for people to express and engage. But I also do think that, there's a piece of me that sees it as just a fun album too, right? Like I do have a tendency to kind of roll into all the political spaces and to think about all the cultural implications of something, but also, it was just a great album that made you want to move and made you want to be engaged and made you want to dance and made you want to, explore some of these ideas around relationship, around lust, around desire, around divinity. I think that it was an important moment to think about all of the ways that he was questioning that play, or the ways that he was questioning how that might manifest in relationships that are both platonic and sexual and romantic. And I think cars could represent a way for that to be, received by folks. Things that go fast, things that go slow. Technology, obviously, a big issue and presence in his work. But also, again, the divine also represented in this space. So it wasn't just a love among humans, it was also this opportunity to explore all these ways that we might engage the love between humans and spirit.
I also think it's important. It was also pre-HIV, right? I mean, obviously not pre, but in terms of the public having knowledge of it and talking about it. So there's a kind of sexual freedom that's there, right? And what we get all through Prince's music is unfettered Black desire, right? And I think 1999 really captures that moment in his music, right? In a way, and as Monique just said, in multiple kinds of ways, right? Both in terms of love, but also in terms of sex, right? Platonic relationship, and obviously, with, a creature from above.
Yeah, I mean, I also think the use of the cars is just shrewd, right? He's trying to link himself deliberately back to a history of the connection of rock and roll and cars, all the way from Little Richard, Chuck Berry. The list goes on and on and on. So I think it's very deliberate, and of course, using cars as a metaphor for sex also deliberate too. When he's talking about his own ethos of dance, music, sex, romance, that's linked to the whole ethos of rock and roll itself. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Maybe the drugs part isn't as prevalent here, but it's definitely sex and rock and roll record, and I think that's what he was deliberately trying to do that. The other thing I would mention is Delirious, which is also a song that's lyric is very much about a kind of metaphor of cars and ignition and so on, is a kind of rockabilly track, right? It's trying to deliberately evoke the sound of rockabilly, right? Elvis and others of the 1950s, in that moment in which R&B and rock and roll, there was a particular tension around those things, but rock and roll was the vehicle that brought a lot of white stars to the visibility that black stars didn't have access to. So he's doing that deliberately. Also, of course, Horny Toad, which doesn't end up on the album, but is one of the B-sides and shows up on later records. That's another rockabilly track. So I think he was very much, and I'll just also say for him, that album, the second album, for him, that was he considered it a contrived record. He was doing it deliberately for commercial appeal, and he felt he lost himself in the making of that record. And so Controversy then became his album, which he was kind of back to himself, right? Feeling himself more and allowing him to be his true eccentric, self. And then I think 1999 continues in that trajectory. But he does it with an even more shrewd and commercial lens, right? He's thinking, how do I take this to the next step? And so I think the use of the cars, the use of some of the themes and language on the record is designed to, in his words, excite and to provoke. That's what he said he wanted to do with this record, and I can't think of a better example of success in actually achieving his goals.
Oh, I love this point about Delirious and Rockabilly, because we have Delirious, we have Horny Toad, we have One Day I'm Gonna Be Somebody on the Time record at the same time. There's a whole sort of mini catalog. You can make a whole playlist of like Prince rockabilly songs. And there's sort of two ways to engage with that, right? One is it was hot right then. There was like a little Stray Cats moment, and he wanted to, he wanted to get whatever was hot. Like he was going to do his version of that in his lens, and that's there. But also I feel like there's a very 1980s recontextualization of the 50s going on, right? So you have, a TV show called Happy Days that's set during Jim Crow, right? You've got a lot of like that Reagan era of like recontextualizing the 1950s. How much do you think that, again, like, obviously that's the context in which he's literally born, but how much of that is like intentional recontextualization, recapture that he's doing in taking these formats and making them his own?
I saw it as explicit, and even later in his live performances, he would actually mix in Elvis songs with this, with Delirious, and pretend to be Elvis, and then kind of be like, pfft, right? So it was an intentional way. I was like,
he's like, that's light work. I can do that.
Right. But I was like, okay, that was intentional, right? That was an intentional reclamation of what had been stolen, and what had been reassigned in the public consciousness, and so. He couldn't necessarily come out in the 80s with that, but I think that later on he was kind of acting like a lot of black men do, which is when y'all start telling the truth, right? And you start, I was like, I noticed that, like in this, you turn a certain age and they're like, I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna speak my truth now. And I think that he had reached a point in his career where he was saying, okay, I'm gonna intentionally mix this with Elvis so you can make these connections and make it obvious to you, but I've been thinking about this all along. So that's how I interpreted it.
Yeah, and I think also Freddie Mercury had done the same with Crazy Little Thing Called Love. When you think about Freddie Mercury also as a person of color, even if, he wasn't seen that way publicly, that was a kind of reclamation of Elvis's image and his masculinity designed for a particular purpose. The other thing I would say, there's one interview that Prince does around the time that 1999 is released, because he does very few interviews, and it's with Robert Hilburn of the LA Times. And he says, I want to clear up 3 things, right? And he says, one of the things I want to clear up is that I'm not Stuart Price, which is the name that he was using as a pseudonym to produce on the Time records and other records and so on. So that was a weird obfuscation, right? It was kind of like,
Don't protest too much.
what is this? But one of the other things that he says he's not is that he's not gay. And I thought it was interesting that he kind of comes out defensively almost and says, hey, this is not what I am. Part of that, I think, has to do with, obviously, his self-presentation, his visual presentation. You look at the gatefold. I had the gatefold for 1999, right? The actual double album where he opened it. And that image where he's lying on his stomach with his, pants down and his, half naked. It was like, what is going on?
A little bit of cheeks peeking.
Cheeks were coming. I mean, the eyeliner. I mean, I was scared, for my mother to have me listening to 1999. It was frightening to bring Prince into your home. I feel like we have to remember that, that one of the things that he did, he was such a libertine that he introduced this kind of notion of perversity and taboo and kink back into culture at a time in which we needed it because it was, Reagan conservatism. That was really important.
And that's why the stuff with Vandross and Michael Jackson and Rick James is important. We forget Rick James was walking around with locks, dreads, with braids and glitter at a time when black men didn't do that. And Rick James and Michael and Prince were playing with androgyny in certain kinds of ways. Prince was always clear that he was also highly sexual in that context in the way that Michael was. And ironically, the one person that we can identify as actually queer in that moment, Luther Vandross, is the one who's actually playing it straight.
Which had its benefits and effects.
However,
too.
I do want to say sexuality and being genderqueer are 2 different things, right? And so his presentation of gender and Prince's engagement of gender was a totally separate thing than his sexuality.
Right.
So and I remember seeing him, and he was pretty. Right? So, I mean, let's talk about the video, right? The Little Red Corvette video comes out, and I was like, who is this person? And I was like, I don't know. I literally was like, I don't know if that's a man or a woman. I mean, I do know because I knew the previous music, but I was like, but looking at this person is pretty. This person is beautiful.
Yeah.
And, I want to look at this person. I don't care what their gender identity is.
And he knew it and acted like he knew it, right? That's an unusual thing.
Exactly.
He's like, I know I look good, and I'm going to tell you about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, played
And
off.
that's why I think Jason's point about making sure we pivot this alongside the MTV moment, right? Because he looked pretty to everybody in that moment, right? In ways that had he come 10 years earlier, there might not have been that opportunity to cross over in that.
Right, if we contrast to Sylvester, if we contrast to artists who are
Right.
sort of,
Right.
So I love this point about the Elvis recontextualization and the reclamation. I think if you fast forward, well past that point, at the Super Bowl, he does a series of covers that are mostly songs that black artists had reclaimed from white artists. So you have Hendrix taking, Dylan's All Along the Watchtower. You have, doing Proud Mary, which is, is known as a black artist song instead, the white artist that wrote it. And that's a very intentional move. So it feels like this is sort of a continuous thread. There's a lot we can do there, but I want to come back to, I think, the thing that arrested me about this album in the moment, even though I think, Monique, you and I are about the same age, and I was too young to be thinking about it, but the way that Prince sort of casts and presents women on this album is pretty extraordinary, right? In the history of, R&B music was the context he came out of, certainly in the context of pop music at that moment. And one of the things I want to start with is he does present women in a position of power fairly consistently. And it's not I mean, I think it's in dialogue with the Baby Please tradition and R&B, but it's not necessarily that same voice. I want to start with you, Monique. Like, tell me about your experience hearing this album and how he was presenting, portraying, and giving voice to or letting voice come from women on this album.
So I come to this maybe a little differently than some others, because there were sort of two things happening in real time. So young me experienced that album in a very specific way because I was a survivor of sexual violence. And so being a survivor of sexual violence and encountering this album, I was like, oh, I can reclaim a piece of myself, right? Something that had been taken, I could reshift and say, I have agency, right? I have decision making, and I was young, right? But, having already been sexualized, I was entering this, and, Sugar Walls was out, like there was all kinds of stuff that was like in my consciousness, but it provided an opportunity for me to very intentionally say, I can be a sexual being, I can engage sexual material, and it not be about exploitation or harm. Adult me is like, this is just pulling from like Betty Davis, right? Like this is pulling from the tradition in Black music of strong Black sexually empowered women who can, be the one in control, who can have multiple lovers, who can, engage with a type of confidence around her body, around her interaction in sexual encounters that, would present her as, maybe an anomaly to a society that wants to render women as subservient and without agency around their sexuality. But in much of this tradition, it just pulled off the blues women for me, and so I think, so I sort of straddle these spaces around what he was engaging, especially, again, I go back to how he was presenting himself, how his gender was presented as a fluid engagement around all of this, where in many ways experiencing Prince in woman form in this music or through this music was just an opportunity for us to engage the fluidity of these conversations around gender identity, performance, and sexuality that just cut across many of the contrived structures that keep us from seeing each other as human. So, it was a fun space. It was a very confusing space. It was an empowering space. And I think that in many ways, it builds from the tradition, like I said, of the blues that did the exact same thing.
Lady Cab Driver, right? And when you're listening to the female moans towards the end, and I heard something. I heard something distinctly different in Lady Cab Driver than I heard in, say, Marvin Gaye's "You Sure Love to Ball," or Major Harris's "Love Won't Let Me Wait," which were big Black man, soul man songs for the 70s, in which those moans were connected to the performance of Black male sexuality in a moment where Black male sexuality did not have public forum. What I heard with Lady Cab Driver was an acknowledgement of a woman's pleasure, right? And I think it's a very, very subtle difference, right, in the terms of presentation in the context of the songs, right, and in the context, again, of who Prince is.
I mean, I'll just add a couple of things. One of the things that's interesting to me about Lady Cab Driver in particular, but also Automatic and other songs in the record, is what I would describe as a kind of transitive singing. So in other words, you were just mentioning sometimes the difficulty of, like, is this a man or is this a woman visually with Prince, but the singing itself is it's like a trans singing, right? You don't sometimes know where he's landing in terms of gender. It definitely breaks the binary, right?
Is that moan him or not?
Say it again.
Even
Right.
Is that moan Prince or not?
Is that him or not? Right. And then the use of other singers, and so it's playing with your ear, right? And it's playing with sexuality. So that's one thing to mention. So even when he's doing a song like Lady Cab Driver, which is kind of ambiguous in terms of the presentation of sexuality, there's something even sonically that we're hearing that is also ambiguous. But I think the other part of it for me that I want to highlight is that Prince, throughout this record, lyrically, thematically, is presenting masculine anxiety, right? And sort of like he's unsure. So when you listen to something like Little Red Corvette, you know, everything's like, I guess I should have known by the way you parked your car sideways. Like, I don't know. Like, did you? Are you? Should you? Is this who I am? You know?
Why do special women make me beg? Like, I don't get it.
Yeah. He can't figure it out. And then, you know, something in the water doesn't compute. I don't know. Is this, what are you doing? Who are you in relationship to me? And then to me, my favorite song.
Which is not swagger, explicitly.
Oh, it's
right?
absolutely
That,
not. Compared to Teddy Pendergrass, turn it off. You know, turn off the lights. It's like, turn it off. It's like, Prince is like, there's no turn off the lights. He's like, should I turn off the lights?
But look, there's no turn off the lights, but there is this wild performance of women's pleasure on Lady Cab Driver.
Absolutely.
Right?
Right.
So he's
Right.
so satisfying, right, that she's like, right? So there's this, I mean, it's honestly like this way of engaging that does tap into this, I mean, both an insecurity, but also a narrative about this male performance that brings her to this space.
And I think International Lover, the Quiet Storm moment where he's on the plane, right? And he's like narrating the plane, like it's Meatloaf's Bat Out of Hell, and he's like doing a full-on narration. That is such, it's like so campy. It's just, I don't know how you get.
And we were talking about this yesterday, right? Is that record, now that we know that, you know, sort of, you know, at least partially conceived for the time, which explains the campiness, but also in the demo we hear Prince playing it both ways, right? Where he's sort of chuckling at like, all right, look, they're gonna go with me on this because it's me. But if Morris had done it, then it would have been like, that's funny, right? And he knows he can be on both lines of that. But I think there's something extraordinary here about that performance of, and scripted, but that performance of like sort of female pleasure and a sort of non-swagger based male presentation is very different in the way that International Lover being in falsetto as opposed to Barry White, right, is very, very different. Like this, how much of that, like, I'm going to subvert, how much of this I'm going to subvert, so how much of this is just intrinsic?
Can I just say, though, it's you know, he's doing a little bit of Philip Bailey, right? The deference, kind of the falsetto, the reaching, and Smokey Robinson. But remember, he also says on this record, I want to fuck the taste out of your mouth. So it's not like there's no swagger.
Less smoky there.
It's not like there's no swagger going on. He's doing both things at the same time. He's having his cake and eating it too, which is probably the way he would have liked it, right?
Yeah. Or aggression, right? Like, I don't want to conflate swagger with aggression, right? And so I do think there is this way.
Yeah,
when
it's not
he's-
humble.
Exactly. But it's also, you know, like when he says, no, I want to fuck you, and he's really like, no, I really do, right? It's like, that's aggression, right? Like, that was him coming with a very aggressive, specific, explicit demand, right? As opposed to, I actually interpret International Lover as being more like about swagger, right? Because that's the song that was like, oh, like the women want to hear that, right? Like you know, like, I want to fuck you, okay, but like, you know, can you talk to me about all the ways that you want to please me, right? All the ways that you want to engage me, right? Those are the things that also settle in the female consciousness, or in the consciousness of somebody who's attracted to Prince, or attracted to, you know, some of those narratives that would bring them in. As campy as it is, that's, to me, was the swagger, right? And not necessarily the aggression.
And you know, an International Lover is a different kind of song, right? We could have a whole conversation about Prince slow jams, right? Because we don't talk enough about them. And some of them are about a slow drag, right? Where you're at a party dragging. International Lover is not about that. This is, International Lover is about after the drag. Right, so you're not actually paying attention to the campiness because you're into some other business.
And you know, you also, one of the songs that I think was unfortunately left out of the record, but I understand why, is How Come You Don't Call Me Anymore, right? Which to me is Prince just completely stripped down, him at the piano, probably one of his greatest vocal performances ever. And, you know, he's literally just, you know, how come you don't call me? The wistfulness, the loneliness.
It's a Drake song.
It's
Come on now. Except he's playing the piano on it, though. No, but I think that sort of speaks to the clarity of vision about what the album was. If you can leave a song that good off the record, you're like, I know what I'm doing here. I do want to get a plug in, and D'Angelo, you always inspire me on this. The end of International Lover, where he says, you know, thank you for flying Prince International. I'm a bit on a multi-year campaign. I think they need to rename the airport in Minneapolis to Prince International Airport. And the thing you need to hear when your plane lands at that airport is thank you for flying Prince International. All right, I just got to get All right, thank you. I just got to get the plug in because this is the one room in the world that's going to come with me. All right. So I'm going to I want to change direction a little bit. We talked a little bit about the cars and transit and this technology piece, but this is in many ways also an album about technological anxiety, right? So 1982 is the year that Time Magazine says the person of the year is the personal computer. We start to have all these sort of 80s era movies that lead to war games and all these kinds of things. So we have a enormous anxiety, understandably, as it turns out, about technology's role in society. And the first things you hear on the record are as we heard from Dan, like computer samples of drums. I think people even forget something like in Automatic, the chorus of AUTO-matic, that is, again, in dialogue with the Kraftwerks of the world. It's supposed to sound like a robot. Like now it just kind of sounds like a funky, chorus, but it's like, it's a robot sound. Obviously, something the water does not compute. So all suffused through this record is technology's coming that clearly has something to do with the apocalyptic 1999 that we can look forward to here at this moment. Talk to me about what was your experience of that and how is that connecting to the cultural conversation around where tech is at?
I think about the fear of technology and black music in that moment, right? And let me go to Earth, Wind, and Fire for a moment, because the album they dropped in 1982, is the last album that has Larry Myrick and that whole horn section. They go electronic with the next album, right? And they get rid of the horns, and it totally changes the sounds of Earth, Wind, and Fire, if not R&B, right? Because you don't want to have to pay all these horn folks.
And Kool and the Gang,
right.
too. It's
right.
around the same time.
So you're hearing this kind of ambivalence. And I always go to SOS Band, Just Be Good to Me. For me, that is the grand statement of where R&B can go in terms of electronic music, right? And it's not surprising, right? It's a Jam and Lewis production, right? So it's coming from the family tree, right, that's experimenting and doing the great work with electronics, right? And we lose in that moment, right, any of those black artists who can't make that transition from acoustic, to electronic, right? And R&B becomes electronic sound in the mid-1980s that sounds so different from the R&B that we would have been listening to in the 70s.
I mean, I think you also have to remember, 1999 comes out in 1982, although, again, for me in Canada, I didn't hear Little Red Corvette until 83, because it was released in November 82, but I didn't hear it until a little bit later. So 83 for me was that record. But that's, there's so much stuff that's happening at that time. And even if you go back to 82, Planet Rock is like spring 82. The Message is like summer 82. I mean, there's like Thomas Dolby, She Blinded Me with Science. There's so much music that's coming out at that time.
Herbie Hancock.
Hancock
Rocket.
and what he did. Sylvester did one of
and Street Songs, right? It's coming. Rick James is working on that right then too.
Right, same time. So I feel like there were a lot of people kind of working in that space, trying to figure out the post-disco moment. What do you do? How do you engage with synthesizers and drum machines in such a way that's going to allow you to, as Dan was saying earlier, maintain the human aspect of it? And I think of 1999 as an album of cyborg grooves, right? It's both human and also machine kind of in this dance, in this sort of choreography together. But, as much as Dan focused on the Lynn drum machine on this album, to me it's the Oberheim. It's the synthesizer that is really, really important besides just the drum machine. So that's 1999. Dun, 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 dun. I mean, talk about a riff that just sticks in your brain. But that's done. That's a preset from the Oberheim. It sounds like an ARP as well, added on top of it. But the synthesizer to me is what brings in that feeling of Kraftwerk and Planet Rock and all of that sort of sci-fi kind of weirdness. There's something sonically coded in that record through the use of the synthesizers. Something in the Water Doesn't Compute.
That's the sound of the future.
It's a sound of the anxiety of that moment that is also, I think, referencing the future in some ways, right? But it feels like that to me, when I listen to the record very closely, that's how I understand it to be an album of its time that's thinking about what could or could not happen in the future because of the nature of the synths and the drum machines primarily.
Yeah, Monique, I want to come to you. I just want to go on a brief detour for folks who may not know the story, and I'm sure there's a better expert on this in the room, but the narrative I've heard is the 1999 single comes out in August of '82, and Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones are in final mix down on Thriller and decide to add that big punch at the beginning of the song Thriller because they're hearing that Oberheim synth, because they're hearing that sort of wall of sound. And so the impact is pretty much immediate. I mean, this obviously becomes the biggest record of all time, but the innate sense of this is what it's got to sound like changes after just the opening, literally the first thing you hear on the record and the first single that's out in the world. Sorry, Monique, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I also want to extend Dan's analysis around the tension conversation and then restraint and like overexpression or heavy expression because he's engaging this new technology, but he's also engaging ancient technologies. And so I want to say that here because often when we have these conversations about Prince, that was a spiritual man. And so when we start talking about the way that he plays that out in 1999, a very relatively explicit album, Let's Pretend We're Married, where he says, I'm in love with God, right? Like, he's like, I just need to let y'all know that. Like, in the middle of all this stuff, and you might think I'm crazy and all this stuff, but I'm in love with God. To me, that was his way of saying, okay, here's the ancient technology that I have, even while I engage you in this new technology, And so I just want to say that because I think it's important whenever we discuss Prince to ensure that we acknowledge the ways that he brought in these ancient ways of knowing and these ancient technologies into his production of art and his discussion of life.
Yeah, so a lot of times what we're talking about is analog versus digital is really about tradition versus the future, and it's like he's got both with him. So this goes into, I think there's also a reckoning that has been somewhat lost to time now. It's been 40 years. The idea of punk funk, right? And I think, Rick James is really the most associated with this, but obviously, just to sort of draw the analogy, because I think it is something that's not as widely known, punk rock was the, maybe Kiss or whoever was the putting too many people on stage and got too many lights going on, so we're going to have the stripped down thing. And it made sense to draw the analogy of punk funk. Is okay, we're not going to have 55 people in a spaceship on a stage. We're going to have a couple people and use some synths instead of a horn section. I'm curious about, is that also a reckoning with this turning the page from what parts of our history do we bring with us, what parts of that context? Or is it, well, we can still carry that forward and do it this new way? Because what does that technology make possible? What is that sort of that reckoning about how much of our tradition we're there? Because he does bring the horn section back, but it's not for another 5-10 years.
I mean, if you have something to say.
I think for Rick, punk funk was a bit of a marketing gimmick as well, among other things, right?
Yeah, it gets you into certain places.
Gets you into certain places. Gets you, he used that to write himself into existence, and because people were trying to not allow him to exist in the way he wanted to. So I think that's part of it. The writer Robert Christgau would talk about Prince's rhythm on this record and some of his other records as what he'd call a force beat. And that's a term that was often used to describe punk music, where the beat was just almost too fast for the feeling of it, and it was just like this driving beat. You hear that in Let's Pretend We're Married, right? It's a driving kind of punk-ish beat. Interestingly enough, I will say Let's Pretend We're Married did I think poorest in terms of chart success. Like, it did not do well at all on the pop charts, and relatively, and it certainly didn't do well on the black music charts. 1999 did well in the black music charts, didn't do as well in the pop music charts, but Little Red Corvette was the song that really propelled Prince on the pop charts, the Hot 100, and it had even bigger success than even on the black charts. And I say that knowing that these charts were extremely segregated, and they still are today, but they were definitely very, very segregated then. So I think part of it is, that Prince is somebody who was deliberately and very shrewdly calling on certain kinds of sounds and rhythms and sonic elements in order to achieve a certain kind of success with white audiences who are into punk and rock music. But I don't think there's much about 1999 that's a punk record necessarily, except for the fact that somebody like an Adam Ant could have been called a punk singer too, and there was a lot of people trying to do post-punk and also post-disco at the same moment. And so I think Prince was one of those people who was doing that. but very specifically calling on certain kinds of rock traditions in order to generate success for himself.
So I want to take us to a place, which is the Kiowa Trail home, right? He's in sort of basement of this suburban house in Chanhassen. He's making most of his records made there. There's population of Chanhassen at that time is probably about 7,000 people, and there's probably maybe a couple dozen black people in town, right? And yet this does sound like a dance floor filling record. It does sound funky as hell. It certainly is not actually inspired by place, clearly in that place, like it's places in his mind, places he's been. But I sort of want to like push that question of like, what do we think Prince does by going there? Is that I own this place and I have a place of my own? Is that security? Like how the hell does this record get made there? How is that possible?
Creative space. Creators need quiet. Creators need time to engage all the ways that they know and have learned things. I think, we write, right? And my process is to go to a quiet place. I write about black people, I write about black girls mostly, and I can be in Costa Rica, right? Writing because I need the quiet and I need the opportunity to understand and process all the things that I have experienced and engage, throughout my lived experience. So I've always seen like the places where Prince created as these opportunities to insulate and also, create something that is the reverberation of all of these different lived experiences. And in order for your brain to process these things, and in order for your consciousness to absorb, to then, do something new or to innovate, I do think you just need a moment to detach from the things that might be distractions.
I would also say, like the best black artists, Prince was an archivist, right? He had a wellspring of everything that had come before him. There's a song by Gene Chandler called Rainbow. He does a Rainbow 65 and there's a Rainbow 80 version. And as he plays out the song, particularly when he does the live version, right, he does this scream and a yelp and talks about, I want to bite you. And I remember listening to that, and I was like, oh, that's where Prince got that from, right? Because it's very kind of Prince-like, right? My favorite Prince moment is him performing on a talk show. And he does, and this is like in the early 2000s, and he does a cover of D-Train's You're the One for Me. All right, and it's like knowing that it touches a particular button for a generation of folks. He did that throughout all his career, so it wouldn't be surprising to me that he would be someplace obscure. And because he has this wellspring of black musical knowledge, right, that he's able to draw upon it and create something in those spaces.
And some of it was done in Los Angeles, too, at Sunset Sound, so it's kind of a mix of both, yeah.
Yeah. All right. How are we doing on time? Do we have time for a Q&A? Okay. I just want to make sure to get to this part, which is, I know all of you through your work as academics and authorities and experts, as I said. But I think this is one of those sort of entry points to a new phase for Prince for a lot of people. I wanted to prompt each of you to talk about like the moment or the moments on this record that sort of speak to you, that brought you to a new place, that, changed your view of what Prince was in your sort of musical life.
Where do you start?
It doesn't have to be comprehensive. It's just about the feeling.
Just personally, you mean? Yeah. I mean, for me, again, as I mentioned to you, this was really my kind of introduction to Prince. I definitely remember our Much Music, which was our video station. They played Little Red Corvette non-stop. It was like inundation. It was like constant. You just could not get away from it. It was just all the time. And I actually loved 1999. I thought 1999 was just funky. And so I was kind of like against Little Red Corvette just because I'd heard it. So it was like overplayed. It was like on the hour, every hour. Casey Kasem's top, whatever. You heard Little Red Corvette. And 1999 for me felt like the track that I wanted to hear more of. But for me, I think it was a really holistic thing. So there's no particular musical moment on the record that stood out to me more than any other, although I have to say Automatic I just love. I also love the Pointer Sisters Automatic, so maybe that's something to do with titles, and I don't know, those tracks, that 80s black R&B computer thing, just did it for me. But I think it was the total presentation of everything, right? From that very strange album cover, and again, I hadn't seen Prince. I didn't see the cover of Dirty Mind. I didn't know any of that. I had a little book that I bought. It was like one of those sort of fan books of Prince. And again, I used to hide it from my parents because I was like, I don't want them to know that I'm like listening to this, because my mother was very against anything that was seen as being kind of illicit or explicit, etc. And there were moments on 1999 where I had to literally turn the volume down if I was playing it. Oh, he's gonna say the word fuck. Turn it down. I knew where they came. I would just turn it all down.
Like our parents couldn't figure that out, right?
Whatever, But for me, it was the visuals. That video for 1999, directed by Bruce Gowers, who had done Bohemian Rhapsody, that was like, who were these people? What planet did they come from? Could I go there? Could I go to that place wherever Prince and Dez and all these folks were doing their thing? Because that to me was this, it felt like a space of liberation. And particularly because I think Prince for me he's somebody who was so committed to anti-normativity, right? He didn't want to do the norm. He was not going to be committed to the norm in any way. And so for me, the whole record sounded like anti-normativity. It did not, and I couldn't say that word then, and I don't even say it much now, but, it's to say that he was creating this sort of space of possibility and, where you could exist in this kind of openness that was so powerful to me at that time. That moment in the 80s, Cold War and Reagan, and nuclear proliferation. We used to all have to watch a movie called If You Love This Planet by Dr. Helen Caldicott, which is this anti-nuclear war film, and it scared the shit out of us as kids. Like, we were frightened in that moment. We had to close our windows, for Chernobyl, because we were worried acid rain was gonna fall on us. And so Prince's music for me just felt like this opportunity to connect to your body, to the erotic, to the spiritual. It was so life-affirming. And that's what I really loved about it. Even more than any one specific song, it was the feeling of possibility, of promise. Even 1999 is a song about potential annihilation, but he's like, we're going to dance. We're going to dance our way right out of this. I was like, oh, that's what I want to hear. And that's what I knew that even as a child, that was powerful for me. So,
yeah. I think of three distinct moments with this album. I think of coming to school one day, and Letitia Sims was sitting on the bench, and Letitia was writing a letter, and at the end of she put on lipstick. We went to a Catholic school, okay? So she put on lipstick that she was gonna take off, and she kissed the letter, and I said, what are you doing? And she said, I'm writing a letter to Prince. And now I'm like, oh my God, Prince got a letter, or his people got a letter that, you know how little girls write their names? Her name was Letitia, so that I definitely had a little heart at the top. I was like, he was probably like, oh my God, these children are writing me, right? But it made, I don't know, I remember that as a moment of let's discover this new album, right? Me and Letitia, right? And then, I think of Delirious, because it was a fast song, but we did a routine to it. We built a routine. And, little girls, black girls, we make routines to just about any song, but it was fun to create a routine to this highly explicit song that we could hide from other people, that we could practice in our little Catholic school and when nobody was looking, and it just felt like a moment of collective rebellion, but also, just sort of embracing this person that we all loved. And then my third thing is, at the end of the songs on 1999 is when I feel they get best. At the very end of the song. So a lot of times when people are ready to turn it off, that's when I'm like, no, it's about to get good, right? And so I feel like for Little Red Corvette, it's when he's like, and the ride, I said the ride, right? I was like, that's the one, right? I I was like, these are the moments where you're like, he's tapping in, and I'm right there with him, right? Like, I'm right there. And that, to this day, is like, for me, like 1999.
I was a senior in high school, right up the block, at Brooklyn Tech when it dropped, and I lived up in the Bronx. So me and my boys, Frank Paul Jr., the late B.J. Moore, we take the train down. We would take the 6th train to the Bleecker station, right? Get off and go downstairs to catch the D train because all the pretty girls would take the D train into Brooklyn. And I remember us sitting around, standing at the train station downstairs waiting for the D train, or it might have been the N train also, having this debate, right, in December of 1982, January 1983, about Thriller in 1999, right? I didn't know at the time I was practicing my skills of being a music journalist, right? And definitely at the time I was Team Michael, right? But Michael took a long time in his cycles. So by the time Purple Rain came out, and then Prince hit us back up again, in 85, and then again with Parade in 86, it's like, whatever, Michael. So that stays with me for a long time. And to this day, my walking playlist, 1999 is on it. And you talk about the end of songs, right? And he goes straight Pentecostal sanctified church at the end of that song, right? And there's no question, whatever comes on, right, I get a little hyped. And when he starts talking about them lines in his pocket, especially when he hits that last one, and it's like, it's just every time for me, right? It's just a new experience hearing. And there are very few songs that I listen to continuously that still have that kind of effect on me.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to tell mine anyway, even though it's not my job to do it. But I remember very distinctly, Little Red Corvette was on the radio. I think I had a similar experience to you, where like that was the sort of, where we were. This was the only place our community was going to hear Prince. And my sister was always a fan, and she had the record on, and you had the record player. She had one in her room, but there was the one in the living room. And you get to where, girl, you got an ass like I'd never seen. And she runs through the living room to go and turn the record down because he's about to say the word ass on a record, and my parents are going to be like, that's it. It's done. We're never listening to this person again. And that left such an impression on me. I'm like, this guy is cool as hell. Like that. Like I don't know what this is, but there's something great here. And that just stuck with me. I was right. He was. But that was really like so evocative of just like, oh, that's trouble. That's trouble. And I just loved that. That was still, Elliot, I know Elliot left, but like, that thing Elliot always says about like the transgression is just a powerful thing. So first of all, thank you all for sharing this, because I think it's so important to connect. I think there's this place in culture for this great artist, and also there are moments in our lives to which this has been the soundtrack, the punctuation, the healing. I think that's sort of all there, and I think it's just important because I don't know anybody who pursues this line of inquiry academically, intellectually, without it starting from the emotional connection. I want to sort of connect 1999 to the rest of Prince's work, right? So I've heard people sort of say they see something like the Batman album as a little bit of a revisiting of some of these themes about the sort of futurist impulse. Obviously, MPLS Sound much later is this explicit sort of throwback to these sounds. We had heard mention earlier of Black Sweat taking the Lynn drum, out of the cabinet and putting it back onto, into the mixing console. How much, and the thing I think that is really clear is when people say, the 80s were influenced by the Prince sound, it's much more 1999 than it is Purple Rain. Mm-hmm. There are very few, like even when somebody does a throwback track now, they don't sound like Purple Rain. They don't have all that reverb, and they certainly don't have all that guitar. They're Lynn drums and Oberheim synthesizers. So even in terms of the shadow it casts on the rest of the quote-unquote Prince sound or the Minneapolis influence on pop music, that's all there. What does this do to change sort of Prince's musical trajectory? What are the impacts that the fact that this does have that commercial success that we talk about, that also there are songs clearly he was immensely proud of on this record. I don't think there was ever a tour after this where he didn't play something from this era, even when he was sort of disavowing Prince with those things. I just want to hear from you all about, like, what does this do to change what he does musically, how he evolves as an artist? Small question.
Big question again. It's his commercial breakthrough. right? In a certain kind of way. Again, with the idea that there's a continuity of his work throughout creatively, but this is clearly his breakthrough moment. And it's, for an artist who's been trying to generate a certain kind of visibility, he's hit the top 10. And so I think he wants to hit the top 10 a lot more. And so that makes sense. It opens up this space where then, you've got Purple Rain. And Purple Rain is the album that I was down with. I mean, every song, there was no filler. It had the incredible ballad, Purple Rain itself. Outside of International Lover, which I think of more as a Quiet Storm soul, like a slow jam, I don't think 1999 has as strong a ballad except Free. And I'm Free's the one that I skip. I'm sorry to say. Sorry for Prince fans. I do skip it. I think in the trajectory of those songs on that record, it's not the song that I'm most attracted to, just for me. And so, I think he figured out with Purple Rain how to do it, also tied, of course, to this huge, movie apparatus as well that would allow people to understand his mythology, because he was self-mythologizing in that movie as well. So I think 1999 is a crucial step that gets him to Purple Rain, but I don't think it should be seen as just a step. I think it's a complete artistic statement in and of itself. But it is the beginning of a lot of stuff. And then he repurposes a lot of the music. Some of the stuff that gets left off of 1999, like Can't Stop This Feeling I Got, ends up on Graffiti Bridge. Bold Generation ends up on Graffiti Bridge. So he's like, clearly this record means a lot to him because he's figured out how to cohere this Minneapolis sound, which is that Lindrum, which is those Oberheims, synthesizers, which is the particular use of space in those tracks, the explicit material. Like he figured it all out, and how to fuse rock and R&B and pop and all of his other genres and styles into the seamless whole that sounded like Prince. Right, so if somebody wants to sound like Prince, that's the sound they're going to go back for. It's that 1999/Purple Rain sort of sound. Not to say they wouldn't try to evoke other aspects of Prince's career, but I think when you look at what people go for and they say, hey, give me a Prince mix, they're looking for that, right? It's something very specific to this moment.
That's actually the moment when I play them something else.
Yeah.
Right? Because for me, I really experienced 1999 in the same way that I think. So I experienced the trajectory of Prince's music as a laboratory. I think he thought he could do any genre, and he tried every genre. And I feel like while there are the callings for him to return, I also remember his rejection of that. Right? I often quote him in saying, people want me to play what I used to play, but I want to play something else, right? I feel that way with some of the books or some of the lectures, right? Like people want me to write that again. I want to write this, right? And, so I feel like 1999 is one sound in there's just a full body of dynamic engagement around sound and content and exploration and questioning that his music gives us. So, I do treat it as, sort of an isolated moment that, yes, he pulls upon later, but it is an isolated moment of who he is at that time, what age he is, what he's experiencing, all those things that sometimes we'll see him draw upon in his older age. My therapist tells me we're always, at some point, every age that we've ever been. Right? And so when we're thinking about that, and he's later in life on musicology, for example, when he's like calling back some of these ideas, and people are calling it his comeback, and it's ridiculous for those of us who were with him all along, right? But it is this way of him then saying, I've always been these things, and I'm still these things, and I'm becoming. So I guess that's the word, right? Prince's music is constant, even now when we still hear these new iterations and new things, like it's still becoming. Even the things that we've heard before, when we listen to it again, we experience it because he created something that allows it to become continuously in our consciousness and in our spirit. So 1999 is a very specific moment in time, but also a part of everything that would follow and everything that came before it.
So are you working on a Prince book?
Oh no, Prince is fun. Books are work.
So my favorite Prince album is Around the World in a Day. And I mention this in the context of talking about 1999 because the reason why he could make that album was because of Purple Rain. Purple Rain was the album that allowed him to give no fucks for the rest of his career.
That's right.
Right. But he doesn't. But he doesn't make Purple Rain without the success of 1999, right? And one of the things I lament in these comparisons between Michael and Prince, and again, they were very different kinds of artists, I wish Michael had not given any fucks after Thriller. Right? Instead of continuing to chase whatever that success was. And I always appreciated that, in that regard, Prince was a classic R&B and blues artist. You were going to get some new shit every year. Right, and if possible, multiple times a year, right? He was not going to buy into that cycle as it became a cycle in the 80s and 90s where drop an album, push 3 singles, push 2 videos, go out on tour so that you're still singing the same songs 3 years later, right? That, previous generations of black artists, first of all, couldn't afford that kind of cycle because they ate off of those records and they ate off of those tours, and black folks weren't going to pay to go see you to see the songs that they saw you sing last year, right? So you need to come out with some new shit in order for us to, continue to come out and see you.
All right, I'm going to get one last quick question in before we go to audience Q&A because I know you all got questions. Perhaps not the most loved release that Prince ever did is 1999, The New Master. But I think it's one of the most interesting, which is, first of all, there's the name, right? And he said he wanted us all to remember, if you don't own your masters own you. But also the declaration he was making about, I will go to literally re-record one of my most famous songs, and I will recontextualize the artwork, all the things that he did. This is how serious I am about ownership, about equity, and using, again, one of his signature songs, but also one of the sort of cultural moments he was best associated with. People all said, 1999 is going to be Prince's payday, right? That's going to be the moment he does it. And he doesn't do it in any of the conventional ways. He uses the moment to tell a story about ownership and equity. I'm curious about, one, does that record have a reason to exist other than that purpose? Is there something to listen to there? But I'm curious about the, what is the cultural context, the grounding for that? Do we have precedent for that, for making a symbol, no pun intended, out of, something that much of a signature recording? What's our history that you all know this, better than anybody? What's the history of saying, I'm going to take my recording and use it to make this point about ownership, equity, the way black artists get exploited? Do we have precedent, or do you invent it?
I can't think of a precedent. Doesn't mean that there isn't. I just can't think of one. I don't know.
Sam Cooke. Yeah, I like that. I think I contrast to something like "Here, My Dear," right, which is a statement about ownership and equity, but it's a little bit more
off
petty.
A divorce. Right.
Yeah, it's a little more petty, right? It's not sort of the same thing. But it just feels like that's such a profound thing to have done with that song and with that moment. And also, he, to the point about moving forward, had no reverence for this is this thing that's untouchable. He's like, I can make it again. I got that.
Yeah, I can only contextualize it by saying I saw Prince at the Essence Festival concert that he did. I think 30th anniversary Essence Festival concert. I don't know if anyone was there. That was incredible. Oh my gosh. And if you remember, for those who were there, and those who've seen him in concert as well will probably be able to echo this. There were times where he would say, "All right, I got 18 more hits for you. Hits. I'm going to do this song, and then I'm going to play 11 of my hits in a row." So he's very conscious about the idea of the hit and what that is and what that means, right? And I just felt like at the concert he was deploying those hits, right, in a way that was almost like, it was like a game. It was like, all right, you ready for this? You're going to get 18 more hits in a row, and then I'm going to do 2 songs I like. I was like, whoa, what? It's like, not that he didn't like the hits, but you know what I'm saying? He was like, I'm going to do my thing. And so I think, he saw 1999 as a hit. It was a thing for him that not only was a commercial smash, but also had this kind of cultural value to it, right? And that everybody knew it, and it was a party jam, that like a universal party anthem. And I think he understood that what he could do at that moment was deploy that, right, in a way to not only link back to the history of him having done the song itself and to claim ownership around that, but also, to sort of take it back in a lot of ways, right? And I feel like he was an incredibly, I used this word before, but shrewd, right? And that's not a negative term at all. It just means somebody who's very sort of calculating about what he was doing at every moment. And I afford him every aspect of intentionality around that. He was very clear about what he did and what he didn't do, and he learned a lot in the process of trying to take back his music from Warner. Realizing at a certain point that maybe certain kinds of affiliations with major labels worked at certain points, right? You were just saying he not disavowed the past, but he said, I want to do things that are forward thinking, like how Fela did and Miles did. But then at other times he's like, I'm going to use the past, right, to my advantage, and I'm gonna deploy it in the ways that make sense for me at this time. And I think it's a powerful lesson for any artist.
And also a way to just also be like, let me show you who I am and remind you. Like there was arrogance there, right? And so, I think there were, in those live performances as well, perhaps as in the, is there a reason for this remaster to exist, or, the reminder, like, let me remind you of who I am. Because there was a lot of talk about whether he was still relevant, right? There was talk about whether he could still fill a stadium, whether he still had it. So, part of the invitation around "Let me show you all my hits" was like, let me remind you of who I am.
I think as Black people, we always have to sometimes, inscribe ourselves into the culture in a context of, diminishment and dismissal. We're constantly being diminished and dismissed. And I think you sometimes have to have that sort of confidence where you say, this is what I have done, this is who I am, this is my material, and this is how I think about it, and this is how I put it forth.
It's a Jay-Z line, right? Allow me to reintroduce myself.
Yeah, that's right.
So I'm going to turn on the light just for a hot second, and then I'm going to turn it off, so my apologies. And again, this is the code if you want to ask a question. Menti.com 8403-7192. And this is the question I want asked. If we don't ask any other question, we're going to ask this question, Theo. So I don't know if you're in the room or if you're on the live stream, but I love you. All right. So let's ask this question. If you had to replace one song on 1999 with a vault track, which track would you replace? And which song would you replace it with? And why?
You want somebody to be killed up in here. Well, I already told you. I already spilled the beans. So for me, it's Free. And I will just say specifically the thing that I just don't like about Free, although I think it's an absolutely fine, competent, accomplished track, and it's something obviously that he performed live and came back to a lot. It just, for me, it musically, it feels a little bit saccharine. It feels a little bit trite to me musically. I know what he was going for. He wanted this big universal love anthem, but it just doesn't feel like it has the edge of the rest of the record for me. And so I would probably replace that track with, The Vault is crazy. There's so much good stuff there, but I would probably replace it with How Come You Don't Call Me Anymore? Because even though I understand why he might have left that off the record, I think that is just one of the great Prince songs, period, for me, of that time period. I will also say Irresistible Bitch is just a ridiculous record. So I don't think we have to talk about like replacing things, but if you could add things, I would add that track. That just, that's like James Brown, on some drug that just takes it to some other level. It's crazy.
I wouldn't touch it. So, I'm one of those people that doesn't like remakes, like the original. And so, with some rare exceptions around the remake. But yeah, even Free, right? So if it took a while for me for Free to resonate with me, but mostly because I wanted him to more deeply interrogate this notion of freedom. And I felt like he was sort of playing into some narratives about what it means to be free that didn't necessarily reflect the lived experiences of a lot of people of color in this country. It didn't address explicitly anti-blackness and anti-indigeneity enough for me. So it was all of that. But I do think I leave it because that's also like who he was at that time, what was happening at that time, what the degree of discourse was at that time. And so, I'll listen to it. Sometimes I do have to be like, okay, listen to Free Monique, right? But I do experience it and then sit with the questions that I have today about them.
Yeah, I think it helped that I first encountered the song as a child, and so you probably can connect with it better as a very literal sort of. It is a little bit. It's not as complex as is later.
It's just the whole record is a jam, and then you get to Free, and you're like, It's like Heal the World and Dangerous. It's like, oh, God. Skip on the
It's
CD.
not that far. It's not that far.
That's an extreme example, but I'm just saying. Sometimes you just want the sequencing to just take you.
I'm sorry. If you don't skip Heal the World, you got more patience than me.
I'm going to co-sign both of my panelists and keep it moving.
All right.
Very diplomatic.
All right. Actually, Anil, do you want to answer that question?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Here's another question. Would you consider 1999 a better album sonically and rhythmically than Purple Rain?
One word answers.
All the better.
Nah, you can go.
It's just different. Purple Rain couldn't have existed without 1999, right? I think there's no question about that. But they're just different records. I think that's all. And something like Automatic, I think, could have been on Purple Rain. It sounds like a track that doesn't sound that sonically different. So I think that's a bit
Except it's like half an hour long, and the whole Purple Rain album.
Oh, of course.
Yes.
Yeah, these things are more. But I think they're part of the same whole. I don't know if I see them as being that different.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I'm going to jump in on that one, which is I think 1999 is better produced across the board. I mean, obviously, I love the Purple Rain album, but I feel like it sounds like very much of its time. And I think there's a reason people don't try to make their records sound like that, where they do try to make their records sound like 1999, because it's like that is a distinct sound, the simplicity and the intentionality about it. So, yeah, I have a slight bias there. Because I think some of the production on Purple Rain was also masking the, it's a live production, and we got to smooth over some of the background noise.
Some of y'all in New York might remember Tower Records, and they had their little magazines, and inside they had the Desert Island Disc. So like if the Desert Island Disc said I could only take one between one of these two Prince albums, I'm taking 1999.
All right, so I am going to ask a question, but there aren't any questions coming, so I just want to remind everyone of the Menti code, which is 84037192. I'm trying to say it
That's
really
the worst time
slow.
song I ever heard in my life.
I know. Isn't it awful? 84037192. Okay, here's the question. If any, what current artists do you see emulating the genius of the 1999 album? What current artists do you see emulating the genius of the 1999 album?
Okay, that question would presume that we're listening to a lot of current artists. No shade, just being honest.
I mean, is that even a goal for current artists? I don't think it is. I think there's just mostly, there's folks that, I'm talking about mainstream, obviously, there's the independent artists that do that stuff, but I don't think people who are making popular music right now have a goal of making a record like this for the most part.
I would say maybe Miguel.
Yeah.
And I say Miguel because, not because he's trying to sound like Prince, but because he's experimenting with different sounds in a way that invite us. Like when I think of Miguel, I think I heard Sure Thing first. And I was like, dang, that's like the Temptations, right? Like, if I were a you are, if I was this, you can be. Like I was like,
it's Motown style lyrics,
exactly.
for sure. Yeah.
So I was kind of like, oh, that's interesting how he brought that to this. And then the more I started to listen to his music, the more I watch him as an artist play with different, genres and sounds and looks and invitations, and sometimes it does it for me, sometimes it doesn't. But I see him experimenting in a way that Prince was experimenting. So that's why I would say Miguel.
I mean, I just want to distinguish the question there. Yeah, I mean, we should clap for Miguel for sure and for that. I just want to distinguish because the question is not who's doing what Prince was doing, because there's like nobody. Like, let's just say that. But I mean, there's a lot. I think Miguel is one person who evokes Prince, Frank Ocean for sure, Janelle Monáe, Dirty Computer, the 1975. They're very explicit about their connection back to Prince. I mean, there's a lot of people I think who are working in that space who are doing really interesting work that's sort of out of the box, eccentric, pushing the creative envelope in a lot of ways. And I think Prince was the inspiration.
Are there folks making an album this weird that are mainstream artists right now? Janelle?
We're in the moment of pop music weirdness, right? And also pop music transgression. I think Prince opened up that space. So it looks different on different people. But if it's a Billie Eilish, I mean, I also would link somebody like that, the work that she's doing with Phineas, not sonically, maybe not musically to Prince, but the kind of space that he opened up is definitely, has led to a lot of the current artists doing.
Yeah.
SZA's
To
record.
me, Lil Nas X is sort of the closest in terms of how Prince was perceived as just pure, wow, this guy's terrifying. To the audience that Prince terrified back then. Right,
and also a calculated, strategic
100%.
sort of genius in terms of
But the
marketing.
record's good. I mean, that's the thing. Is it's easy to just sort of poke people and be like, I scared you because I made whatever devil sneakers. But instead to be like, you're right, but instead to be like, and the record's good. I think that's a rare thing. Sorry, go ahead.
So actually, I have the final question, and there's an angel out there. Whoever you are, you're an angel who asked this question because you're setting us up for the next roundtable discussion about the 1999 Super Deluxe box set. So I love you. Thank you. So here's the question. What are your thoughts on how the Prince estate has approached the proliferation of reissues of his material, particularly the 1999 and at Sign of the Time box sets? I'll say it one more time. What are your thoughts? I feel like I'm at bingo. I've been at bingo all weekend. What are your thoughts on how the Prince estate has approached the proliferation of reissues of his material, particularly the 1999 and Sign of the Times box sets?
I feel like all these questions are designed so that we can't walk out of the room and hold our heads up. Look, I think reissues and box sets, they can be important for reintroducing back catalog, right? There's a lot of young people, my students, have not heard Prince's material, right? It was not even on streaming services for a very long time. So there are a lot of generations that just have not caught up with the material. So I think on one level, just in general, the reintroduction of back catalog through the use of reissues is not a bad thing. I think it's a good thing in many cases. I'll just talk about the 1999 box set. I think it was interesting for me because I heard the stuff that was left out as opposed to what's on there. And by hearing what's not included, and I do think of making a record as a process of not just creating something and putting it on using technology to create something, but also figuring out what shouldn't be on there at all. That's a hard thing to do, to sculpt away as opposed to add. I was fascinated by all the incredible material that just didn't end up on the record itself. And to hear different versions and so on, I think that is really important in terms of a kind of connoisseurship of listening, getting people to be able to understand what someone like Prince did. When we talk about his brilliance and his genius, you have to break that down. You have to deconstruct it. And I think a release like that allows us to do that because it lets us hear more. We can just hear more, and we can hear what he was thinking about or not thinking about through the process of addition or subtraction.
Okay, so I'll say this, knowing that it's like live streamed and recorded. I feel that the Siths who run the estate do not understand the Jedi.
There you go.
That's a mic drop.
That was a mic drop. I always understand the business motivation for this, right? And what we learned from De La Soul, where you had a generation of folks who didn't have access to the music, right? It's important to get the music back out there. But if it's not carefully curated, by folks, first of all, who have a love of the artist, but a broader love and understanding of where the music sits, right, culturally, I think it's always going to be problematic.
I'll just sort of tag on a couple things. One thing I'd sort of say is it's an impossible task. There's no way to do it right. There's no, because also even everybody's interpretation of like what would Prince want. First of all, is that a constraint that you want to accept? Because he wanted a lot of different things over a different time. The second is, and you can't do it. No matter which one of those versions of what you pick, you can't do it because you're not him. And so I think that the impossibility of that task is there. I think you have a lot of cooks in the kitchen, sis in the kitchen, whatever you want to say, and there's different agendas, and some of those can even be valid, but still be irreconcilable. And so like that makes the task impossible. So like granting all that, and also like, you know, putting my like business hat on, I'm like, I don't envy anybody. Like you could have one single person with complete knowledge trying to do this task and not be able to do it. So given those constraints, I'm like, well, especially compared to like the Purple Rain re-release, which was like, I know why it exists, but other than that, whatever, right? Like it was kind of like, I get like it was what it was. I thought this was as well done as it could be. Like we keep in mind if the state of how these things go is, you know, the Michael Jackson state putting out records that don't have Michael Jackson on them, which is where the bar is. Like I hate to say it, but that is where the bar is.
This is being recorded, by the way.
Bring it on. What are you gonna do to me? I'm some dude on the internet. You know what I mean? I don't. Oh no, I'm not gonna buy your record. Like I don't give a shit. Like you know. But I mean, but that's what's really real, right? Is the like. If the bar was low there. They could be like, is Michael Jackson on the song? Yes or no? And can you do better than clear that bar? So like that's where the sort of the level of it is. The truth is, I do think even for all the faults and flaws that I think any of us in this room can point out in some of these releases, just being straight about it, was this done with the care that happens for the estate of a white artist of similar stature? I think it was. Now that's not saying it was good. But I think it was done. That's where the state of the art is, where the music industry is, and what it is, because it's like there was archival material. They tried to promote it. They did a pretty good job. People were aware the record came out. They didn't compromise the original material. There wasn't a like we put a guest verse by the Flavor of the Month on one of these records. That is where the state of the art is. Now I'm not saying like I co-sign that's how the industry should be, but that was sort of where I landed, and I was like I heard things I was grateful to hear. If nothing else, I was brought to tears hearing the alternate take of How Come You Don't Call Me? That's all I need in the world.
All right. So I mean, we have 2 minutes, and I'm going to use these 2 minutes because this is a good question, and it was touched on just a hair. Can the panelists speak a bit more to how not having Prince's face on the album cover of 1999 and the commercial success of the album affected his trajectory? You guys are bringing it today. Anybody want to take that one? Can the panelists speak more about how not having Prince's face on the album cover of 1999 and the commercial success of the album affected his trajectory?
I'm going to leave this one for these two because I know they're going to tear it up. But I'm just going to say what I did appreciate was that one in 1999. Having that on the cover was extraordinary because it allowed us to talk about things that we do not talk about. In a time where you saw women's breasts on TV, they were always the punchline for things. I remember seeing, like, you know, there's a culture of showing women's bodies, and there was never a culture of showing men's bodies. And when I saw that one, I was like, is that really what it is?
So I know Jason's going to have a more sophisticated answer to this.
Is that right?
But you know, these questions go both ways, right? So it's Berry Gordy in Motown not wanting to put the Isley Brothers on the cover of an Isley Brothers album, right? But, you know, thinking about Bobby Caldwell just passing, right? You know, TK didn't put Bobby Caldwell's face on the cover of his album either, right? Because Tina Marie, right? Also a Motown in that context, right? I think for Prince, because you got what was inside the album, that makes a big difference, because that was never going to be on the front of the album, right? And so I don't think the motivation in that case was so much trying to cross him over, right? Because you still, and this is really before CDs and there's no stream, so you literally got to open up the album and be like, oh shit, right? So it still had that factor of it, right? So it was always clear who you were listening to.
was also the MTV era, right? So this saturation of visuals. Not that they could have anticipated that, but there were Prince visuals everywhere. So, has any artist ever deployed mystery and privacy like Prince? Dirty Mind was just like all out there, right? Which we appreciate. But 1999 was a little bit of a different era. It was an era of hypervisibility for certain kinds of artists. And I think what Dan was saying earlier about the restraint, this was also a kind of visual restraint that was important for that record and the way that it was received. It could get into people's homes. Like, I couldn't bring Dirty Mind home. I could bring 1999 home, right? Around the World in a Day, sure. Or Purple Rain, sure. Love Sexy? That was a little challenging. Some difficult conversations in the high school water cooler, So, again, Prince knew how to do both of those modes, and, it was all part of his arsenal, right? And it was all intentional, but it was also like his arsenal of what he could do. And that was a great moment of learning about the power of mystery, of just sort of, veiling yourself in order to produce a certain effect.
Yeah, I mean, I spent so many hours staring at that album cover and his eyes in the nines on that cover. And the mysteries of the liner notes and who is he talking about and who's JJ and all that is there, right? And so he was on that album cover. For me, like, he was right there. There's his eyes, there's his lips. That's Prince.
And he was definitely inside it too.
Yes, sir.
All right, we have come to the end of our 1999 Roundtable. Please give a hand to Anil Dash, Jason King, Monique Couvson, and last but definitely not least, Professor Mark Anthony Neal, Prof. Neal.